Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the second day of the State of the Map Africa conference. If you missed yesterday, we had a successful first day where we had a bunch of sessions happening. And for the second day, we're going to start with a keynote session, followed by a mapathon, and then a number of sessions after the networking break. So we hope you'll stick around. And just something to mention is that for this session, as you are in room 1, for also the introduction for the mapathon, you'll also be in this room. But after that introduction, we'll break out and go to separate rooms, and we'll share how to do so after the presentation that's coming after this. But for now, I'd like to introduce our first keynote for the day, who's Monica Nthiga from the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, specifically for the East and Southern African hub. And she'll be presenting about transforming OpenStreetMap communities in a digital age. So without taking any more time, Monica, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Laura. I have been involved in designing and implementing open mapping projects over the last 10 years. So designing, implementing extremely exciting ideas with sort of potential for influencing policy decisions, influencing ordinary citizens to understand their role and the role that map data plays in everyday lives and be part of the creation and also the exploitation and the maintenance of data in the region. More often than not, looking at map data and map products as an outcome instead of a process that requires strategic planning and that needs to be integrated within kind of wider open data policies, political, social, economic conversations, has sort of been the biggest setback. And that's why I titled this conversation today as Reinventing OpenStreetMap for the digital age, where we are right now. So as Laura mentioned, my name is Monica Nthiga. I work for the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team as Regional Director for Eastern and Southern Africa, and in charge of setting up the Open Mapping Hub for the region. And where I would like to start us today, even before we kind of look at some examples of technological kind of developments, is to look at kind of the journey that we envision when it comes to OpenStreetMap and OpenStreetMap data. So we typically look at OpenStreetMap data and also mapping through what I'd call kind of five lenses. We look at where we have absolutely no mapping happening in the continent. We look at where we have, what we call the initial mapping level, so basic buildings, roads. And of course, our vision being to grow that to where we can have a lot more attributes, where we can have real-time information, where we can have street-level kind of data within OpenStreetMap. And that process itself is a very complex web. It's a very complex journey in the sense that that's where the nuances of whatever technology we need in order to be able to move from basic buildings, basic roads, to adding water points, to adding village names, and to adding maybe what time a building is open or what time a hospital is open. One of my favorite illustrations of the complexities of technology, particularly with a focus to OpenStreetMap communities and the more practical nuances that call for technological development improvements within OpenStreetMap, is a diagram that actually shows the different levels of what's required to actually have a complete kind of matrix of OpenStreetMap. So at the very basic level, we look at disasters or crisis situations that inform or that influence the creation of OpenStreetMap data and the use of OpenStreetMap data. So in recent history, some of the most influential ones, you had the Nepal earthquake, the COVID-19 response situations. And then in between there, we do have organizations. So we have Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, You have other humanitarian organizations. You also have the open mapping communities. You have the OpenStreetMap community, youth mapper chapters. And then beyond that is kind of the different technological interventions or improvements that have happened over the years. For example, when OpenStreetMap started to date, what kind of mobile improvements, mobile data collection improvements have happened. But then the ultimate goal really is we are guided by sort of what I'd call regional or global kind of frameworks, being able to contribute to things like the Sustainable Development Goals. So what this means often is that any developments, any improvements to OpenStreetMap must speak to kind of these different layers, must speak to these different frameworks in order for them to be inclusive, in order for them to be used by everyday citizens. Another example.
Yes? Your slides are not transitioning. May want to check them.
All right. Let me just see.
Maybe you can stop sharing and then try. Okay, now they are transitioning.
All right. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. So I'll just pick up from here. So I was speaking to kind of the evolution of mapping within OpenStreetMap and kind of the different layers that inform the kind of mapping or that inform the technology that's being developed. And at the very basic, if you think back through to 2010 up to now, we're able to see that one of the key influencers of the use, the development of the technology has really been kind of ongoing crisis. The Nepal earthquake, I was talking about sort of Mozambique, Cyclone Idai, COVID-19 global supports. And then we look at how imagery keeps being improved or keeps being updated to date, as well as the different tools that have been developed in order to help support contributing to OpenStreetMap or collaborative kind of mapping. Something else that another analogy that I'd want to kind of share before I move on to the practical use cases has to do with the data lifecycle. The bulk of kind of the work that OpenStreetMap communities do, data is at the center of it. Data use is at the center of it, data creation is at the center of it. But when you think about kind of the data lifecycle from a bigger kind of picture, it's threefold really. So we have kind of pre-processing, the data creation, the data selection, all through to publishing. And then we move to kind of the exploitation or the linkages, and then finally the consistent kind of maintenance of that data and kind of the updating of that data. So again, the question to ask ourselves is where do the different OpenStreetMap communities support this entire process? How are they part of the bigger ecosystem? Where have we been able to actually innovate or develop processes or tools that actually speak to the different sectors? But most importantly, recognizing where we are strongest, where we can actually support the cycle more strongest, and where we play more of an advocacy kind of role within the entire cycle. So I'll moving into how OpenStreetMap communities can then are using technical, economic, or scientific knowledge in order to meet open source and open data needs in Africa. And I will share 3 examples, 2 of which are external and one that is within the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. So the one that we might all be familiar with, for example, has been the evolution of citizen, crowdsourced data. To date, the first point of kind of curation of primary data really is to start to look at citizen-generated data, to look at involving local communities, to look at involving local organizations in actually sharing exactly what is happening within their localities. And a good example of this I'll give is the Ushahidi platform. So that has been used globally and that has played a very key role in kind of crowdsourcing and data gathering. The next example that I'll use that of a collaborative tool or a development tool, again, is Tasking Manager that most of us may be familiar with. And the advantage of a tool, for example, the role that Tasking Manager plays in coordinated and organized mapping. So being able to coordinate volunteers and organizations of groups to map on OpenStreetMap, to continuously update OpenStreetMap data. And the third example of technological development from the region that I wanted to highlight is from, the third example that I wanted to highlight on this is from Josem. So being able to create open access to encourage innovation and the emergence of multiple projects sort of globally, within the African context. So a fast, fully open source platform that globally distribute map database services and allowing OpenStreetMap data to the country of your choice and ensuring kind of thematic consistency. So I wanted to highlight those three examples, and then I'll jump back into kind of the title of my talk today, which was looking at how to reinvent OpenStreetMap in the digital age. So despite the kind of the progress that's been made, which is immense, we are still dealing with very consistent, I'll say, gaps or very consistent challenges that you will hear when you're speaking to OpenStreetMap communities, whether locally at national level, at lower subnational levels, or even speaking to some of the users of kind of the data or some of the support functions around OpenStreetMap communities. So whether it's governments, whether it's international NGOs or national NGOs. And the first one really is that not everyone is online. Statistically, it's estimated that about 71% of the population in Africa is actually offline. So what this means is vast majority of citizens do not understand how OpenStreetMap works and potentially are missing the mark when it comes to contributing or influencing improvements within OpenStreetMap. So technological improvements, as well as data use improvements. The other thing that I wanted to highlight as a potential challenge is there's very little effort when it comes to growing an individual contributor. And my feeling is that working through, for example, learning accelerators, putting a little more effort into growing the individual contributors, into targeting individual citizens would actually help to kind of narrow this gap. And what this means is, again, while we do have mobile data collection tools, the likes of ODK that supports contributing to OpenStreetMap, there is still a gap when it comes to offline contributions, and also to help kind of navigate the existing internet, the existing sort of digital divides. The other thing is we do have lots of mapping that's taking place, lots of remote mapping, but again, where there is a huge gap has to do with validation of this data as citizen-generated and ground truth data. So this points to kind of the local mapping and the need to, again, close the gap and ensure that we have more individuals that are able to actually add data and contribute to OpenStreetMap. So that marks kind of the summary of today. I really wanted to challenge us to actually think through what other technological developments and improvements can we make around OpenStreetMap that would then help OpenStreetMap to sit centrally within the bigger data lifecycle, the bigger data creation, data use, data storage cycle. And that way OpenStreetMap is integrated within the bigger kind of national and global frameworks, and not sitting isolated or not left out in terms of being an important contributor to development globally. And I'll end there. So and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Monica, for your presentation. Yeah, and I think as you have shared, there's so much more that you can do to make OpenStreetMap more accessible, and hopefully that would mean growing the community here in Africa. So we have a few questions, and the first one is from Janet Chapman, and what she's asking is, how will the new East East and Southern African hub reach and empower rural women like the digital champions you're working with. Then you shared a link for a project and a crowd to map. Yeah. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, yes. When it comes to reaching rural communities and especially women, so one of the goals or one of the kind of the visions of the hub is really to grow the OpenStreetMap communities in each of the countries by supporting, say, local organizations, in this case, in Tanzania, to be the ones to be at the forefront of engaging these groups. So it's very much a tiered approach in the sense that the hub is looking at how do we, one, grow the capacity of OpenStreetMap communities to actually, that are locally based in these countries, to actually be the ones at the forefront of working with these groups. And there's several ways that we're thinking of doing this. So the first one is through granting. So being able to provide, financial resources, but also being able to provide what I'd call capacity development through trainings, through leadership programs that we intend to launch. And that way there is local champions that are actually driving the growth of OpenStreetMap communities in some of these countries. So in short, it's through trainings, it's through grant making, it's through supporting locally led leadership to grow OpenStreetMap communities.
And I think that answers that. And I guess also just to add to that, probably communities should have seen about the call for applications for microgrants by the ESA hub, and I guess that's something that probably a community like Hope for Girls or an organizations like local organizations like Hope for Girls and Women can look out for. Then the second question is, are you building up cases of good practice of mapping towards the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yes. Again, with the hub being, I'd say, relatively new. What I will share is sort of some of our plans around that. So we do have some thematic areas that we are really hoping to narrow down on in terms of supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. So looking at health, looking at climate change, looking at disaster risk reduction. But however, what I would like to say, while we do have an internal process of building up a very strong one, use cases, yes, but also building sort of a community of practice that looks at mapping the technology side of it, but also that's very thematic based focused. That list is most likely going to be influenced by some of the needs in each of the countries. So you might look at it and realize that, for example, a very common area that would need support, for example, is education, but that's not prioritized at the moment. So that would mean, based off of the needs that are coming from the needs that are coming locally, then we would actually be able to prioritize that. But in short, yes, looking at one, building the individual contributors, building the capacity of organizations from a technology perspective, but also being very strong within the continent in ensuring that we do have what I'll call thematic-based advocates within the region. So if there is conversations to be held, for example, on the role of map data in health, then we do need the technology represented, but we also need kind of the thematic understanding, the narrative, the theoretical understanding of how health in each of the countries work. So yes, through building communities of practice around that.
Okay, great. Then the other thing is that last week, it was announced during the NetHop Summit, it was announced that the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team is now a member. So a question is, might you know if that might mean getting mobile phones to rural communities that are supporting HOTOSM's work and work within the OpenStreetMap ecosystem?
I will say yes, and also because that's probably one of the things that's influenced or that has driven her to be part of the NetHope network. One of the things, if you look at, for example, the current call for grants, and one of the things that we kind of articulate is that supporting different groups to actually purchase the necessary tools or equipment that they actually need to do actual mapping. And one of this is, for example, mobile phones. It's supporting, kind of being able to access internet. So I would say yes.
Okay, yeah, I think that's great to hear. I guess a lot of mapping communities can look forward to that. Then I guess we can take one last one. So a lot of the times when you see sort of presentations about the work or the gap that these hubs would come to fill in, we get to see them at a national level. So the question is, do we have a map of where the small local mapping communities in East Africa are to better identify where the gaps are?
I would say that we do have an awareness of some of where the local mapping communities exist, but I would also say that is very much a work in progress. Again, driven by the need to not really start from scratch, but also to use the networks that we have, or to use our contacts with the national mapping communities to understand where they're working at the subnational level. So I would say that is work in progress, but also encourage us, if there are the smaller subnational kind of mapping communities at the lowest level, administrative level, I'd actually encourage us to actually reach out and share those contacts with the hub, for us to be able to understand their work, to explore ways of working. But I would say the hub is really, yes, the national level is kind of the highest level in a country that you're looking to work. But our target really is especially to work with communities that are actually based in areas that are prone to disasters, or areas that are experiencing high levels of poverty. Being there physically, that becomes sort of a priority when it comes to local mapping, or when it comes to the ability to actually, say, collect or gather eyewitness reports or information.
Okay, great. Because we still have some time, I guess you can answer one more. Earlier, when you were answering the first question, you mentioned something about working with local leaders and like getting them trained. So a follow-up question that was shared is that yes, it's great to build a network of leaders via training. How much of that will be online and how much of that will be in person? I don't know if you might already have like more details around that.
We don't have the full details, but in terms of our vision, again, sharing our vision is to actually, COVID permitting, protocol permitting, is to have what I'd call a blended leadership program that integrates both offline and online kind of training, but also more geared towards practical implementation of what you're learning. So, and the concept here being not training leaders to sort of sit offline, but training them and actually having them have some tangible things to lead in their community. And by tangible, I mean, for example, get to be trained as a leader. How do you start an OpenStreetMap community? How do you grow an OpenStreetMap community? How do you sustain it? How do you fundraise, etc.? But also challenging them to actually solve some of the existing problems. So, for example, lead large-scale validation in their countries, contribute to kind of improving the data quality in their country, but with very specific kind of measures. Again, I'll reiterate that's sort of our vision and what we hope to do in terms of growing the local leaders. So they really should be kind of the nodes to help us go a level lower from the national level to more of the subnational levels. Yes.
Okay, and I hope that answers that. Then a new question is that for the current community action grants, what's the criteria that was used to categorize the kind of grants that countries would receive?
Yes, great question. So we have three categories of grants, and the thinking behind actually the grants was we looked at a spectrum of how and where we want to see OpenStreetMap, for example, in the region. And so the thinking here was in some of the countries there really is there are some communities existing, but it's probably one individual. There's less awareness of OpenStreetMap. There's less capacity in terms of skills and knowledge in that country. So in such a country, you're looking at growth. In some of the countries, again, it's more advanced. There's several communities. They're already working with other NGOs, civil society organizations, even working with governments. So at that level, we're looking at impact. So when you look at the grants, the reason why we have the three categories is really to look at to meet the communities where they are. So if, for example, we are very basic, just one person who's really passionate about OpenStreetMap in that country, then we are starting at the level where we could start with supporting you to hold some meetings, supporting you with a monthly kind of grant to help you slowly start building the case for OpenStreetMap, slowly start training people, which is the lowest level of the grants. Then when we go to the next level that looks at community growth, these are the 10 to the 20K grants. Really here it's, yes, we are supporting ideas that are, we are supporting projects that will be doing mapping, yes, and local mapping specifically around any of the kind of the thematic areas that I mentioned earlier. But then there is actually a requirement to show how you will grow an OpenStreetMap movement or a community within your country. So what activities would you undertake to be able to grow that? For the bigger grants, really, it's some of the countries where we've had several other, for example, micro grants in the past. There's an existing micro grant. There's been significant mapping happening in that country. It's been either informed by the disaster preparedness or response activity. And so at this stage, we're looking at taking that community to the next level, so more around impact, and when I say impact, I mean really social impacts, I'd call it medium to short-term impacts that we'll be able to realize with those grants. In terms of then the countries and sort of the plans, we're thinking about this from kind of a 4-year lens. And so if a country is in one category of grant, then they're going to transition into the next category in the next year, based off of the the progress they make with their initial grants. So that's a summary of the granting process and sort of the criteria used for this year.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I think that fully answers how the categories came up and how the countries are selected as well. And I think that wraps up our Q&A session. I think just to end it, you mentioned something that for communities that exist and are not yet in touch with the ESSA Hub team, that they can reach out. So maybe if you could just share how they can do that. Is it on email or social media?
Yes, there is an email. I think I will type it. It's ESA Hub actually at hotosm.org. Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Geoffrey, for also posting that there. Thank you so much. I guess for everyone who's not yet been in touch with the ESSA Hub team and their local mapping communities, please do reach out to the email that Geoffrey has just shared. And Monica, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing with us. It's really great to see all the plans that the ESSA Hub team has, and also great to see some of the things that as OpenStreetMap communities we can do to also evolve in terms of growing and in terms of using digital technologies so that we're more accessible to everyone else within the region. So we'll end it there. See everyone else in the next one.